Please join me in welcoming our panelists for the Big Data Society, How Algorithms Shape Opportunity and Disadvantage. Mary Madden, researcher, Data and Society Research Institute. Taylor Moore, Free Expression Fellow at the Center for Democracy and Technology. And our moderator, Huang, co-founder and creative director at Foossa.
Here we are with fewer chairs and more water. Welcome back. My name is Huang. I'll introduce my friends here. So we have Taylor Moore to my left. She's a Free Expression Fellow at the Center for Democracy and Technology. She's working on preserving the internet as a global platform for speech and association, democratic accountability, all sorts of great things that we need more of. And Mary Madden, on my right, researcher at Data and Society Institute, based here in DC and in New York. And she's currently leading Data and Society's work on understanding privacy and security experiences for people in low socioeconomic communities. So we're going to talk about the Big Data Society. We're going to get a little bit technical, but first we'll define some terms, and then hopefully we can piggyback off of the previous conversation about diversity and inclusion in tech as well, and think about it in the broader social context. So let's actually start with Mary to help us define some of these terms. Like, what is an algorithm? What is big data? And let's just start from establishing some common vocabulary.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for having me here. This has been a really fantastic event so far. It's an honor to be part of this event. I think the last panel was a great example of how if you put some time and energy and thoughtfulness into recruiting, you can bring together some amazing talent and voices. And so it was wonderful to hear the insights that were shared there. So big data. This is one of those really mushy umbrella terms, not unlike the word privacy. That means a lot of different things to different people. In general, the sort of broadly accepted definition of the term tends to rest on three key characteristics. They call it the three V's. So big data is about data that is big in terms of its volume, its size, right? So that deals with massive data sets. It's data that has a certain level of velocity or sort of speed with which it can be captured, it can be analyzed, and also it speaks to the variety of data that's being used in analysis. So really taking different kinds of data sources, whether it be sort of social media data and hiring data, putting those together and trying to draw out some insights from that information. But I think there's really been a lot of debate and disagreement about sort of where the boundaries are, right? There was an article in Forbes not that long ago that talked about 10 different definitions of big data and sort of compared them. It means different things in different industries and in academia. But what I think is really fascinating is the way in which it sort of reflects a shift in attitudes and approaches to the use of data in analysis and decision making. And so the general sort of shift in thinking is that the more data you have, the better, right? And that by acquiring different kinds of information, you don't even necessarily need to know why, but that it might come in handy to combine some insights. Also, it broadly refers to sort of a shift to a culture of correlation and decisions being made sort of out of sheer correlations and not necessarily causation. So one example would be there's a recruitment software company named Evolve that did an analysis of hundreds of thousands of employees and millions of data points to find that a pattern that employees who used newer browsers like Firefox or Chrome tended to stay at their jobs 15% longer. And so it's these kinds of correlations that then get translated into predictive analytics and embedded in algorithmic decision making that can result in positive decisions like increasing diversity in hiring, or it can result in exclusion. And it really, I think, comes back to who is designing the technology, who's at the table, and what sort of values are being built into those systems.
I'm glad you mentioned design. To quote a friend of mine, Jake Porway, who started an organization called DataKind, which pairs data scientists with different social causes and nonprofits, he talks about data as not being facts, but they're processes or products of design, right? So how we choose these data sets, like building off the previous panel of inclusion and diversity, right? If you aggregate all Asian Americans together, they can be seen as the sort of model minority, but if you break it down into, say, Vietnamese and Hmong versus Chinese, Japanese, then it looks very different. So who's making these decisions, and what power do we give them, right? So we'll move over to Taylor now. Are there some terms that you'd like to help us define, or any sort of current examples that you're thinking about big data or algorithms and how that affects your work?
Not so much terms. I think Mary did an exceptional job. I was telling her backstage, I'm like, if you don't define it, it'll just become a huge policy discussion about terms. But my examples that I'm seeing that go to that are what you said about being at the table and the policy problems that affect that. So are people of color at the table? How are the terms being defined? You see in things like fake news and algorithmically driven news, if you're defining what's legitimate news, who's defining legitimate, what does that do to small voices? Are those small voices minorities, people of color? And if so, what kind of reporting is happening? Are you not going to get a story about Ferguson in lieu of something else? And so that's kind of what I look at. So not only about who's at the table, but also how that data is being used, by whom, and how it affects bigger questions of things like access. So if something is being used to kind of like thwart your ability to get credit, or to then start a business, which at the future of wealth is a big deal. So if that's something that's being used because you are being assessed and there's things that are being thought about you algorithmically, and you don't know you're being assessed, you don't know the criteria, and you can't actually probe the algorithm or probe the data, what exactly does that do to your ability to be involved, to be included in the conversation? And so I think it's all kind of stacked against especially people of color, but people from lower income communities, when you are not part of that conversation. And as you all heard from the many panels that have already happened but are to come about what happens, this is kind of the problem when there's no diversity, when there's no inclusion, when there's no fairness along those lines. These are the things that tend to break down in the conversation. So that's generally what I look at from a policy side.
So how do we probe these algorithms, right? How do we make sure that the algorithms and the institutions that are using them, how do we make sure that they're accountable to the people that they serve and to the larger society?
So this is an enormous challenge, and this is something that the organization I work for, the Data and Society Research Institute, is grappling with. I'm also an affiliate at the Berkman Center at Harvard. There are a lot of researchers who are looking into this. And increasingly, it's interesting, there's always sort of like a buzzword of the moment, right? And so I think we're starting to move away from talking about big data to AI now. And a lot of the same concerns are surfacing there. The challenge with the idea of what is often referred to as algorithmic accountability is it oftentimes, or algorithmic transparency, it oftentimes implies that if only we could unlock the algorithm to understand what variables are being fed into a system, that then we could expose the biases that are inherent in those systems. However, we're really reaching a point of such complexity that it's unreasonable to expect the average person to be able to understand. And sometimes, and particularly as we're moving towards more AI systems that are self-refining along the way, we're removing the human accountability aspect from that process. So I think some of the most novel examples are instances where organizations are doing this kind of auditing and experimental research that is highlighting some of the potential biases in these systems. So ProPublica did a really important analysis recently that looked at algorithms that were used in sentencing. And they found that Black defendants were twice as likely to be identified as a higher risk for recidivism, twice as likely to be mistakenly identified when compared with whites. Whites were twice as likely to be mistakenly identified as low risk. And so that was only through their research that was surfaced. And so I think there are opportunities for companies to become leaders in exposing some of these weaknesses of algorithms and some of these risks. And by doing that, they engender public trust, because ultimately people are going to need to trust the companies that they are engaging with, the policymakers who are designing rules around these technologies. I don't think it's reasonable for an individual user to effectively assess these tools on their own.
So in regulating a system like this that's complex, like AI, like big data, you've mentioned there's the companies self-regulating, there's the independent press or independent researchers, there's some kind of user advocacy when they can understand what's going on. And then what about sort of policymakers? What policies could be helpful in this, or what policies are actually holding us back from better regulation of these complex systems?
In terms of policies, you kind of see with algorithms especially, you don't want too many regulations around it because it could thwart advancement. And that's one of the sad things, because as we'll talk about later on in this panel, the benefits of big data and algorithms in terms of things like health. And so you want to kind of provide a fence around this information, but also not thwart and impinge knowledge and things like that. But in terms of making it fair, when things come into contact with the market that affects civic engagement, like your example of the criminal justice system, or even if there's a food product, how does FDA get involved? And so I think that's kind of been the challenge now, is like, when exactly do these things come into contact with already established governmental bodies and regulatory frameworks? But this is kind of a big discussion that's, I think, we'll not cover on this panel right now, but you have things like algorithm ombudsmen and things like that, so people to actually regulate the algorithm. And so there are pros and cons to that. It's a very political question. You have a lot of pushback from companies about what they feel about that, from civil society organizations, how they feel about that. And that also poses problems when there's one person or one body to then look at all the things, all the algorithms that are being used on the market, and what that does to the ability to get things out there quickly and to affect change. And so I think that's going to be a problem that needs a broader conversation with a lot of people. Again, defining who's at the table is a big thing. Companies, a variety of companies, a variety of people, a variety of stakeholders, civil society leaders, and things like that. So I think is probably a good way to start having conversations like that in terms of regulation.
And so there's also this other level of culture, right? Both culture within these organizations that are using big data and AI, and there was talk about the tech bro culture in the previous panel, but there's also this kind of maxim of move fast and break things, right? And so with data, we don't want to squash innovation, but then what happens when they do break things and these sort of unintentional effects, ill effects socially occur, right? How does that accountability happen? But then also, what about the broader culture, right? I think in the US, we tend to be, as a society in general, pretty open to new innovations, and we'll give away our privacy and nobody reads the terms of service, compared to, say, my friends in Europe, right, who tend to be more skeptical about things like this. So how does this sort of cultural angle work to ensure that we have better and more fair
and also to Mary's point as well, with companies, and let's pose a question to you, do you think it affects the conversation about which companies? So if you have public-facing companies who really have a stake in getting it right because they know that their users could go to another platform, versus a company like you're mentioning in terms of criminal sentencing, when there's low competition, when there's only about 3 companies that develop risk assessment software in criminal sentencing, and what that does for the ability to then innovate change. And there's a lot more room for abuse in that context. So I think it really does affect the conversation of
do you have an incentive to audit? Do you have an incentive to convene working groups around your algorithm or around the data that you're using to make sure that when it is deployed on the market, that it doesn't disadvantage people in ways that tend to exacerbate discrimination and stereotypes? But I think that's a problem and a difference with the EU versus what we have here, because you kind of rely on the goodwill of companies, which, as everyone knows, could be a hit or miss depending on who we're talking about.
And I think that's a really important point. Also, Lishan, you mentioned that some of this discrimination can be unintentional, right? And I would venture to say that probably most of it is unintentional, right? Like, people are not deliberately, for the most part, going out and designing tools in which they intentionally want to have these negative effects, right? But there, I think, is an obligation, particularly when you are a business that relies on the analysis of consumer data at the core of what you do, to be aware of and respond to some of these risks. And so to go back to the company I mentioned earlier, the recruitment software company Evolve, it's a really interesting example where they noticed that, again, another correlation where in their analysis they found that people that live further from their employer tend to not stay at their jobs as long. And they realized this could be a variable that becomes discriminatory. So they made a deliberate choice to remove that variable from their analysis. And so I think that reflects, an instance in which, when these things are exposed, companies can voluntarily respond, communicate that out, and it can have a really, positive impact to show that they're being, sort of careful and thoughtful about how they design these tools.
So when we, there's the human intent part where there isn't intended harm, but then we still have these occasional news stories about like racist robots and these algorithms that have to do with machine learning too, right? Of like where the algorithms are learning from each other from data sets. Like, for example, there was a case a few months ago about a man of Korean descent where there was this airport facial recognition software, and it didn't recognize his eyes. Like the robot thought that his
He was
eyes were
squinting.
Right,
Yeah.
that he was squinching, or that he was, his eyes were closed because it just hadn't learned with enough different kinds of faces, different types of phenotypes, right? So how can we ensure sort of just better training data for these machine learning applications as well?
So that's another sort of big multi-million dollar, billion-dollar question right now, and certainly there are innovations happening within the computer science field to try and at a very technical level improve design. But what I think is really interesting about machine learning right now is that so this is the idea that these systems are often learning from data sets that have been collected on previous human behavior and activity. And so that's one of the great risks in terms of discrimination, which is if you feed in biased data from people who are making biased decisions, the machine learning algorithm is going to spit out biased decisions, and it's going to continue to replicate that. However, as these systems evolve, there's an opportunity, I think, to be responsive and proactive in how we identify some of those risks and then respond to them. And so there are researchers at Data and Society that are working on a very technical level to respond to some of this. And also there are companies that are going back to human beings to improve their machine learning algorithms. There was a really interesting article recently about how YouTube relies on an army of human coders to improve the machine learning algorithm to identify potentially violent videos because they don't want advertisers to have their ads appearing alongside these videos. And that's just something that computers are not good at identifying, right? And you have to strike this fine balance between not being overly restrictive. You don't want to be censoring videos, right? But you don't want to be letting this offensive content through. So I think it's really interesting right now that we are still at a moment where the human judgment and analysis is really what makes the difference between high quality machine learning processes and sort of messier machine learning, which in some cases, it depends what your goals are. That may be enough to just have that incremental improvement. But I think in some of these more critical decision-making tools that affect the outcomes of our lives, and particularly those that could differentially impact vulnerable populations, there's a different set of responsibilities there in those kinds of tools.
Right.
This was a really interesting conversation too about how intellectual property could play a part, because to Lishan's point, this was that was actually an anecdotal example mentioned in a paper about how you could improve the information that AI is pooling from by opening up the information that it has access to, which may be locked up in forms of IP like copyright. And so what that does, if you have access to broader data sets and information that are considered fair use because it's non-expressive and use of copyrighted work, what that could do to the ability to limit this kind of bias or like this problem with is this person squinting or is that just their eyes kind of a scenario. And so that's another kind of front you could fight it from, because I think this area is probably so fraught with opinions and technologists who are working at it from a very specific angle. But you also have people in terms of policy who are working on intellectual property policy. And this is kind of an area where the two areas intersect and how the fight could be fought on that front to kind of push the conversation forward in that kind of a way.
If we pivot a little bit, which I think we have already, to opportunities, it sounds like we have sort of AI trainer or algorithmic auditor as these jobs and opportunities that really we need to pay attention to. And then also in terms of legal innovation and policy innovation in this space. What are some examples of positive uses of big data and algorithms and how they affect? I think we've mentioned health and some other things already.
So definitely to pull the terms of health, because I think one thing you kind of get from this conversation, it's a very kind of doom and gloom issue of, gosh, if they're turning against people and really just exacerbate things in the criminal justice system. Exactly, the Terminator argument. So I think you kind of have that, but I think when you look at how it affects, like you said, access to health, and you take even things like psychologists, if you use big data to then be able to see that someone is at risk of suicide, and you could see that a lot sooner, and also like as tools to help that or access to health, if you could find a way to like find a doctor that in terms of your location. I think those are very important. Also, like I said, with intellectual property, how it's a fighting the situation from another front, because there's so many advancements in intellectual property that affect big data, that affect algorithms, and in terms of transparency, and I think those are important to think about how those intersect. So intersectionality in the conversation as well, I think will be incredibly helpful. But also, it comes back to kind of what Mary said about companies thinking about the product they're trying to deploy and having a real conversation and real thought about what's the goal of it? How do we want to, what's the impact we're trying to make here? Have we thought about how it will impact people of color, low-income communities? Because I think a lot of times, like you said, it's not intentional. You just kind of think that, it's neutral. We're going to put it out there and see what happens. But then because the world isn't equal, because education isn't equal, you put out a form of educational technology, which is, I think, what we all can agree is a big advancement in terms of education. But what you don't think about is the algorithm pushing girls towards non-STEM related fields while pushing boys towards it. What does that do to the future of work? What does that do to the future of wealth and that kind of conversation? So I think it's important to kind of talk about the positives of what it could do, provided that you also talk about the need for diversity of who's at the table, really convening working groups of people of color, of civil society organizations to talk about, have you thought about this? Have you thought about what this could do to this community if you deploy it in this way? Because although it is a neutral tool, have you thought about what it could do in a non-neutral environment?
And I think those are really important points. Also, we heard on the last panel, wonderful examples. Laura's company, using sort of big data analysis to improve diversity in hiring. Google has amazing tools they're developing in their Jigsaw project to reduce toxicity online and reduce online harassment. And certainly healthcare is full of amazing examples there as well. I also think there are some really interesting novel examples of experiments to sort of flip the switch on how we think about things like, for instance, predictive policing. So one of the big concerns about predictive policing algorithms is that they are trained on data that essentially represents our history of over-policing in low-income communities. And they tend to focus on street crime. However, there was a recent project from an organization called New Inquiry who said, what would happen if we created a white-collar crime map? What would happen if we created a tool to expose the hotspots down to the level of individual blocks for white-collar crime? And you can look it up. It just came out recently. And not surprisingly, there's a lot of white-collar crime happening in New York City. And so, you know, I think those kinds of novel experiments that, you know, get out into the public sphere, get people thinking about what are the terms under which these tools are created, how are the risks framed and defined, what are the impacts, are incredibly important. And so, you know, as a researcher, that's kind of my pitch for supporting research. So not only do we need to support diversity and inclusion in technology innovation in terms of the people that are creating these tools, but also the researchers, okay? Also the people who are, you know, doing the research and development side, who are doing that kind of critical analysis to identify some of these risks and opportunities so that we can all leverage those in our work.
So let's talk now about sort of on-ramps, which I think you've started to talk about already, which is something like this critical design project on white-collar crime, right? Sort of, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's also kind of using real data, and it's helping to spur these social conversations. And there's always the education point, right? What's the big data equivalent of like teaching kids how to code and things like that? But what are other ways? There's also storytelling, right? Like shows like Black Mirror, where we can imagine these dystopian futures and make choices about how not to go there. But are there other ways that you've been thinking about of involving a more general public or underrepresented minorities and groups like that into this conversation?
Being aware, I think it's such a basic, I really hate the fact that it's such a basic kind of concept, but like harking back to what I said before, if you're not aware that you're being assessed, if you're not aware that it's limiting your ability to access things, it really affects your ability to kind of like pool support to then change the conversation, to then change, as Mira was talking about, how you view terms like crime. Is it street crime? Is it white collar crime? Should it be considered broadly? So I think it's not a very high-level answer, but I think it speaks to that people aren't thinking about these sorts of things and what exactly it's limiting your effect to. So I think if they did, and if they cared, kind of your point about privacy in terms of conditions, if you just sign away or just become complacent about it, then nothing changes, nothing kind of pushes forward in policy kind of discussion. So I think if you actually had, you know, real support, real ground level support about pushing the conversation forward, pushing back on these types of things, if you demand transparency in a certain way, if you demand innovations and changes in this conversation, then I think we could do that together. All of the people could do that together.
I also think, you know, there's a broader shift, you know, towards not away from digital literacy, but within digital literacy to be thinking about computational literacy, and that, you know, this is something that needs to be happening at the elementary school level. Like, you know, this is something that really needs to be baked into our curriculum in a way in which we sort of, at a very young age, get kids to understand what goes into building these tools, how they can manipulate them so that they can understand things like media manipulation. And by the way, like, they love that. They love, you know, acquiring the power to do that. I have two boys who are 8 and 6, and like, you know, that is just like totally
their world.
What they're obsessed with, right? So like, you know, I think that is sort of how we are going to shift the conversation. Right now, we're in this period where, you know, we have generations that did not grow up with the internet. I mean, I didn't really grow up with the internet. You know, it was basically high school that I first started to use email, and that's quickly changing. And so we are going to see a level of sort of basic understanding of digital media being embedded into our lives, of it being something that is a tool that you need to understand how to create and manipulate. But I think that there's a risk in sort of assuming that just because you know how to use certain platforms or technologies that you understand sort of how it works, right? And I think that moving forward, I mean, this is kind of my pet thing right now that I want people to understand, which is that with all of these tools, you know, we need to really be critical about how we're thinking about the use of things like our social media data in this decision making. And we need to be thinking about, when we're putting publicly available data online, how is it being used in ways that might be invisible to us right now, but quite consequential to our lives.
And even just the idea of, for policy, because that's talking about on the ground level of starting with kids, but saying, you know, if you care about criminal justice reform, if you care about education, then you care about big data. If you care about these kind of like these issues just on a way that's kind of been thought about in one particular kind of way for a long time, then you care about this. It has to be part of the portfolio of the conversation, because if this is where we're going, if we are going to then automate decisions about things like that, then this needs to be part of the conversation, which then forces people who make policies to then become knowledgeable about these issues, to then become literate and this kind of a thing. I think that's another way to kind of get people who are already in the conversation, who may not have the background in it, to then be forced into the conversation.
Yeah, and just building on that sort of literacy and inclusion point, right? It's not just about getting the skills and joining the conversation, but also bringing what you have from your own community into it, right? There's examples of indigenous groups that have started to digitize their traditional knowledge, or I was reading about a group in Brazil too that was using big data and Internet of Things to protect their territory from illegal logging, right? And really like localizing it and making their own for their own needs. So any sort of final calls to action for the audience before we wrap up?
Come talk to me after this panel. I want to meet all of you. I just showed up today, but I'm really excited to meet everyone here. It's an amazing, amazing group of attendees. So,
interested to hear more about the diversity conversation, because it really speaks to what we're talking about up here. You know, hearing people who have very positive feedback about what diversity is going to do really is going to help out what this can do in terms of big data and the people that make policies around it and the researchers that do work in it as well.
So thank you so much for joining us today. We don't have time for Q&A, but we'll be in the audience today.